Sometimes the cruelest invitations are wrapped in gold foil. Scarlett Hayes stared at the cream-colored envelope resting beside her coffee cup while rain tapped softly against the apartment window. The return address alone was enough to make her chest tighten. Ethan Cole and Vanessa Blake request the honor of your presence. Her fingers stayed still for a moment, pale against the dark wood table, as if touching the card too long might reopen every wound she had spent the last 2 years trying to bury. Outside, headlights slid across wet Chicago streets, blurring through the glass like fading memories. Inside the ballroom of the Grand Emerson Hotel, everything smelled expensive. White roses, champagne, polished marble. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the ceiling like frozen stars while a string quartet played softly near the dance floor. Guests in black tuxedos and designer gowns floated through the room with effortless laughter, but every few minutes, the same question circled through the crowd in lowered voices. Do you think she'll actually come? Ethan stood near the center of the ballroom, one hand casually resting in his pocket, while photographers captured his smile from every angle. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, the kind that announced success before he even spoke. Beside him, Vanessa adjusted the diamond bracelet around her wrist and leaned closer with a practiced smile. If I were her, she whispered just loud enough for nearby guests to hear, I'd stay home. A few people laughed quietly into their champagne glasses. Ethan smirked, but said nothing. That almost made it worse. Near the front row sat a single empty chair with a small ivory card attached to it. Reserved for Scarlett Hayes. Not hidden in the back. Not placed quietly near the exit. Front row. Directly beneath the glowing stage lights where everyone could see whether she arrived alone or not at all. Ethan's college friend leaned over and chuckled. Man, this is brutal. Ethan lifted his glass slowly. Closure is important. More laughter followed. Soft. Sharp. Polite enough to sound harmless. Across town, Scarlett finally picked up the invitation again. The gold lettering shimmered beneath the kitchen light while silence filled the apartment around her. She remembered another invitation years ago. Their wedding invitation. Back when Ethan used to kiss her forehead while she burned pancakes on Sunday mornings. Back when she believed loyalty meant forever. Her eyes drifted toward the closet at the end of the hallway. The red dress was still there inside a garment bag she had never opened. She had bought it months ago and never found a reason to wear it. Until now. Back at the ballroom, Vanessa looped her arm through Ethan's and scanned the entrance as guests continued arriving. Maybe she finally realized she lost, she said sweetly. Ethan gave a slow shrug, but his eyes kept drifting toward the doors every few seconds. Because no matter how perfect the night looked, one thing still mattered to him more than the flowers, the cameras, or the applause. He needed Scarlett to see him win. Then suddenly, the ballroom doors opened. Cold night air slipped inside. Conversations stalled one by one. Even the violins seemed to fade beneath the sound of heels touching marble floors. And every head in the room slowly turned toward the woman standing beneath the crystal lights. The sound of Scarlett's heels against the marble floor echoed through the ballroom with terrifying calmness. Not loud, not rushed, just steady enough to make every whispered conversation collapse into silence. The red satin dress caught the chandelier light with every step she took, soft and elegant, flowing behind her like she belonged there more than anyone else in the room. Vanessa's smile froze first. Then came the photographers lowering their cameras. Then the guests slowly turning in their seats one by one. Scarlett did not look at the crowd. She did not search for sympathy. Her chin stayed lifted as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times inside her head before finally deciding she no longer owed anyone fear. Ethan stared at her from beside the stage, and for the first time that evening, the confidence in his expression cracked. It happened so quickly most people would have missed it. A tightening in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes. Because this was not the woman he remembered leaving behind in a small apartment with tear-swollen eyes and unpaid bills scattered across a kitchen counter. This woman looked untouchable. Scarlett reached the reserved chair near the front row and rested her fingertips lightly against the back of it. Several guests watched carefully, waiting for her to sit alone so the humiliation could finally begin. But she remained standing, calm, silent. Then another sound rolled across the ballroom. Slow footsteps behind her. A tall man entered through the same door she had walked through moments earlier, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that looked effortlessly expensive. Conversations instantly shifted direction. Nobody recognized him immediately, but something about the way hotel staff straightened their posture around him made the room feel different. Dangerous almost. He stopped beside Scarlett without speaking. She looked up at him once, and the corner of her lips softened into the smallest smile of the night. Not performative, not dramatic, familiar, comfortable. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Who is that?" she whispered under her breath. Ethan said nothing. He was too busy watching the man place a hand gently against Scarlett's back before pulling out her chair for her, like she was the only person in the ballroom worth noticing. Scarlett sat gracefully beneath the crystal lights while the stranger took the seat beside her. Across the room, whispers exploded again, louder this time. Did she bring someone? Is that her boyfriend? He looks like old money. Vanessa forced a laugh and tightened her grip around Ethan's arm. "Well," she said sharply, "at least she did not come alone." But the joke landed badly. Even Ethan did not smile. Because deep down, he understood something nobody else in the room fully realized yet. Scarlett was not looking at him the way broken women look at the men who destroyed them. She was not angry. She was not jealous. She was done. The wedding coordinator rushed toward the stage, flustered after the delay, asking guests to prepare for the ceremony. Music slowly returned to the ballroom, but the energy had changed completely. People were no longer staring at the bride. Their eyes kept drifting back to the woman in red sitting quietly beneath the chandeliers beside a man nobody could identify. Then the hotel manager suddenly appeared near their table, his expression tense with respect. He adjusted his tie quickly before leaning toward the stranger beside Scarlett. "Good evening, Mr. Wolf," he said carefully. "The board members have arrived. They are waiting for your approval upstairs." Ethan's face lost all color. The air inside the ballroom changed so fast, it almost felt visible. One sentence from the hotel manager had turned the elegant wedding reception into something tense and fragile, like crystal ready to crack from a single wrong touch. "Mr. Wolf." The name spread quietly from table to table while guests exchanged confused looks over candlelight and champagne glasses. Ethan remained frozen beside the stage, staring directly at the man sitting next to Scarlett. Adrian Wolf. Of course he knew the name. Everyone in corporate finance knew the name. Billionaire investor. Owner of Wolf Capital. The man whose acquisitions had rebuilt entire hotel chains across the country. Ethan had spent the last 6 months trying to secure a promotion at Sterling & Price Consulting because the company was desperate to land a partnership with Wolf Capital. And now that same man was sitting beside his ex-wife with his hand resting calmly near hers. Vanessa noticed the color draining from Ethan's face and forced another smile, though this one looked thinner than before. "You know him?" she whispered. Ethan swallowed once before answering. "Everybody knows him." Across the ballroom, Scarlett remained composed beneath the soft chandelier light, while servers quietly refreshed drinks around her table. Adrian leaned slightly closer and said something low enough that nobody else could hear. Scarlett laughed softly under her breath for the first time that night, and the sound alone made Ethan feel strangely irritated. He had not heard her laugh like that in years. Not effortless. Not real. During their marriage, her laughter had slowly disappeared beneath overdue bills, canceled vacations, and nights spent waiting for him to come home from work dinners that were not really work dinners. Ethan suddenly remembered the tiny apartment kitchen where Scarlett used to sit at midnight grading student papers beside cold coffee while he scrolled through emails pretending not to notice how exhausted she looked. Back then, he had convinced himself she was holding him back. Vanessa represented ambition, excitement, the glamorous future he thought he deserved. But standing there now beneath thousands of dollars worth of crystal lighting, watching Scarlett glow without him, he felt something unfamiliar settle heavily in his chest. Regret. The wedding coordinator invited guests to stand for the ceremony, but attention continued drifting towards Scarlett and Adrian instead of the stage. Even the musicians seemed distracted. Vanessa tightened her bouquet hard enough to wrinkle the satin ribbon wrapped around the stems. This was supposed to be her moment. Her perfect night. Yet somehow the entire ballroom revolved around the woman she had spent months mocking behind closed doors. Then came the second blow. One of the senior partners from Sterling & Price suddenly approached Adrian's table with nervous energy and extended his hand immediately. "Mr. Wolf," he said with a respectful smile. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person." Ethan's stomach dropped. That partner had ignored him for nearly 2 years inside the company. But now the man was practically bowing toward Scarlett's date. Adrian shook his hand politely, calm and unreadable. "Good to see you," he replied. The partner glanced toward Ethan briefly before awkward silence filled the space between them. Because everyone there understood something Ethan desperately wished was not true. Power had shifted. Completely. Scarlett finally looked toward Ethan then. Not with anger. Not with heartbreak. Just quiet detachment. The kind that only comes after surviving disappointment for too long. And somehow, that expression hurt him more than hatred ever could. Nothing humiliates a man faster than realizing the woman he underestimated no longer belongs to his world. Ethan could barely hear the wedding officiant speaking anymore. The elegant words about love and commitment dissolved beneath the pressure building inside his chest, while guests continued glancing toward Scarlett's table instead of the ceremony. Vanessa noticed it too. Every time someone applauded politely, their eyes drifted back toward the woman in red sitting beside Adrian Wolf. The bride's smile became tighter with every passing second. Scarlett, meanwhile, looked completely at peace. A candle flickered softly beside her wine glass, while warm chandelier light reflected against the delicate satin around her shoulders. She crossed her legs slowly beneath the table and listened as Adrian spoke quietly beside her. Calm, controlled, comfortable. As if being surrounded by wealth and attention meant absolutely nothing to him. That detail unsettled Ethan more than the money itself. Men who needed power usually displayed it loudly. Expensive watches, loud voices, constant reminders. But Adrian Wolf carried power the way storms carried rain. Naturally, effortlessly, dangerous without trying. Ethan remembered the first winter after the divorce with sudden, painful clarity. Scarlett had stood in their apartment wearing one of his old sweatshirts while snow pressed against the windows outside. Half the kitchen lights had stopped working because they could not afford repairs yet. She had looked exhausted, holding unpaid utility bills in trembling hands while asking softly, "Can we please talk?" But Ethan had already emotionally left the marriage by then. He remembered grabbing his coat impatiently while Vanessa waited downstairs in a black SUV. "I cannot do this anymore, Scarlett," he had said coldly. "You make everything feel heavy." Back then, Scarlett had not argued. She simply nodded once and looked down at the bills in her hands like she already knew begging would not change anything. Ethan used to think silence meant weakness. Tonight, he finally understood how wrong he had been. Across the ballroom, one of the investors from New York approached Adrian's table with obvious excitement. "Mr. Wolf," the older man said warmly, "I heard the acquisition closed this afternoon. Congratulations." Adrian shook his hand politely. "Thank you." Scarlett remained quiet beside him, but Ethan caught something important in the interaction. Respect. Real respect. Not the forced admiration people offered for appearances. These powerful men genuinely valued Adrian's presence. Vanessa suddenly leaned closer to Ethan, lowering her voice sharply. "Why is she here with him?" Ethan did not answer immediately because he was asking himself the exact same question. Scarlett had spent years teaching middle school English while clipping grocery coupons and reusing winter coats instead of buying new ones. She hated luxury restaurants because she said they wasted money on atmosphere instead of food. She used to smile over $5 diner breakfasts and secondhand bookstore dates. So how had she ended up beside one of the wealthiest men in the room, looking like she belonged there all along? Then Ethan noticed something else that twisted painfully inside him. Scarlett looked lighter now. The exhaustion he used to ignore was gone from her face. Her eyes no longer carried that constant sadness he had grown used to seeing during the final years of their marriage. Somewhere between losing him and walking into this ballroom tonight, Scarlett Hayes had rebuilt herself into someone he no longer recognized. And the most terrifying part was realizing she had done it without him. People often think heartbreak happens all at once. It does not. Sometimes it happens slowly, over hundreds of quiet evenings where one person stops choosing the other. Scarlett remembered exactly when she first realized her marriage was ending. It was not the affair, not the divorce papers, not even the empty side of the bed during those final months. It was a Tuesday night in February when she stood alone in a grocery store comparing the prices of 2 different cartons of eggs, while Ethan posted rooftop dinner photos with coworkers downtown. She remembered staring at her reflection in the freezer glass under harsh fluorescent lighting and barely recognizing the tired woman looking back at her. After the divorce became official, silence filled everything. The apartment felt colder without Ethan's expensive cologne lingering in the hallway or his careless footsteps crossing the kitchen at midnight. Scarlett spent the first few weeks sleeping on one side of the bed because the other side hurt too much to touch. Some mornings, she could barely get herself out of bed before sunrise to teach classes at Lincoln Middle School. Her students never knew how exhausted she was because she still smiled every morning while writing grammar lessons on the whiteboard. But at night, she would sit by the tiny kitchen window wearing thick socks and an oversized sweater, eating instant noodles while snow covered the city outside. There were evenings she cried quietly without even understanding why she was crying anymore. Not because she wanted Ethan back, but because she no longer knew who she was without disappointment attached to her name. Then spring arrived slowly. The first warm morning came in March when sunlight spilled through her apartment window for the first time in months. Scarlett opened the glass and let cold, fresh air move through the room while coffee brewed in the kitchen. Something about that morning felt different. Smaller than hope, but close to it. She started walking before work every day after that. 30 minutes along the lakefront with headphones in and hands buried inside her coat pockets. At first, she walked to escape her thoughts. Eventually, she walked because it reminded her she was still alive. Little pieces of her returned one at a time. Fresh flowers on the kitchen table. Red lipstick she stopped wearing during the marriage because Ethan once called it too dramatic. Weekend trips to secondhand bookstores. Laughing with co-workers after school instead of rushing home to wait for someone emotionally absent. Scarlett stopped shrinking herself to make another person comfortable. That was the real beginning. Not revenge. Not revenge at all. Rebirth. One rainy afternoon nearly a year later, Scarlett sat alone inside a quiet cafe near Oak Street grading essays, while jazz music played softly overhead. The place smelled like cinnamon and espresso. Outside, people hurried beneath umbrellas through wet sidewalks and flashing taxi lights. That was the first time she noticed him. A man seated alone at table 7. Near the window reading financial reports while black coffee cooled untouched beside him. He wore a charcoal coat and looked calm in a way powerful people rarely did. Their eyes met only briefly before Scarlett looked away and continued grading papers. She did not know his name then. She did not know he owned half the buildings surrounding that neighborhood. She only noticed one strange detail. Unlike everyone else in her life during the past 2 years, he looked at her like she was already enough. Adrian Wolf never flirted with Scarlett. That was the first thing that confused her about him. Most men who noticed her after the divorce seemed interested in repairing their own egos more than understanding her. They complimented her appearance too quickly, asked invasive questions too soon, tried to rescue her before even learning who she was. But Adrian did none of those things. Week after week, he simply appeared at table 7 near the cafe window around 7:30 every morning with black coffee and stacks of paperwork spread neatly across the table. Sometimes they exchanged polite smiles. Sometimes they discussed harmless things like weather, books, or why the cafe made the best blueberry muffins in the city. Other times they sat in complete silence while rain slid down the glass outside. Strangely, Scarlett never found the silence uncomfortable around him. One Friday morning in early October, Scarlett arrived carrying a box of essays to grade and discovered the cafe nearly empty because of heavy storms rolling through Chicago. Adrian sat alone by the window as usual, loosening the cuffs of his dress shirt while thunder echoed softly outside. The waitress smiled when Scarlett entered. "Your usual?" she asked. Scarlett nodded gratefully before noticing the seat across from Adrian's table was empty. He looked up from his papers and gave a small gesture toward the chair. "You can sit here if you want," he said calmly. "The lighting is better near the window." Scarlett hesitated only briefly before sitting down. Steam rose from fresh coffee between them, while jazz music drifted softly through the cafe speakers overhead. For nearly an hour, they worked quietly, across from each other without interruption. Scarlett graded essays in red ink, while Adrian reviewed contracts and financial reports thick enough to make her tired just looking at them. Eventually, Scarlett laughed under her breath while reading one of her students' papers. Adrian glanced up slightly. "What happened?" She smiled for real this time. "One of my 7th graders compared Romeo and Juliet to celebrity drama on social media." Adrian leaned back slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting. Honestly, that is probably the most accurate interpretation I have ever heard. Scarlett laughed again, softer this time, and something about the moment felt dangerously unfamiliar. Peaceful. Weeks turned into months after that. They never rushed into anything dramatic. No grand confessions. No complicated games. Adrian simply became part of her life in quiet ways. He remembered how she took her coffee. He sent books to her classroom after learning many of her students could not afford new ones. When winter returned, he noticed her gloves were wearing thin and casually left a new pair beside her coffee cup without embarrassing her by making it a big moment. Scarlett eventually learned who he was from a television interview playing inside a pharmacy waiting room. She nearly dropped her prescription bag when the reporter introduced Adrian Wolf as one of the youngest billionaires in the country. Suddenly everything made sense. The tailored suits, the respectful staff, the private phone calls he occasionally stepped outside to answer. But what shocked her most was realizing he had never once tried to impress her with any of it. He never mentioned money, never treated her like someone beneath him. One snowy evening in December, Adrian walked Scarlett home after dinner while city lights reflected across icy sidewalks. They stopped outside her apartment building beneath glowing street lamps and falling snow. Adrian looked at her quietly for a moment before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "the remarkable thing about you is that you survived people who only loved you when you were smaller." Scarlett felt her breath catch slightly in the cold air because no one had ever understood her that clearly before. By the time dinner was served, the wedding no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a performance slowly slipping out of the hands of the people who thought they controlled it. Candlelight flickered across polished wine glasses while waiters moved carefully between tables carrying plates that cost more than Scarlett once spent on groceries in a week. But nobody cared about the menu anymore. The attention of the entire ballroom remained fixed on Scarlett Hayes and the man sitting beside her. Vanessa tried desperately to recover control of the evening. She laughed louder than necessary during conversations. She touched Ethan's arm constantly whenever photographers walked by. She even requested a different song from the string quartet, hoping to shift the atmosphere back toward romance instead of tension. None of it worked. Every few minutes, another executive, investor, or hotel representative approached Adrian's table with visible respect. Ethan watched each interaction like someone slowly realizing the ground beneath him was no longer stable. Scarlett noticed it too, though she never reacted outwardly. She simply sat gracefully beside Adrian while soft music drifted through the ballroom. At one point, she lifted her champagne glass and glanced toward the city skyline glowing through the massive windows. 2 years ago, she would have felt completely out of place in a room like this. Tonight she felt calm. Not because of the luxury surrounding her, but because for the first time in years, she no longer needed anyone else's approval to feel valuable. Then Ethan finally walked toward her table. Several nearby conversations immediately quieted. Vanessa remained near the stage pretending not to watch, though the tightness in her expression betrayed her completely. Ethan stopped beside Scarlett's chair, forcing a polite smile that looked strained beneath the ballroom lights. "You look different," he said carefully. Scarlett turned her head slowly toward him. People usually do after 2 years. Her voice remained soft, controlled. That somehow made the words hit harder. Ethan glanced briefly toward Adrian before speaking. "Again, I did not know you and Mr. Wolf knew each other." Adrian calmly folded his hands together on the table. "Scarlett and I met a long time after your marriage ended." Ethan nodded once, though tension visibly tightened his posture. For a second, nobody spoke. The orchestra continued quietly in the background while guests pretended not to stare directly at them. Then Ethan looked back at Scarlett with something dangerously close to regret in his eyes. "I hope you are doing well," he said. Scarlett studied him for a moment. This was the man she once begged to stay. The man whose footsteps used to determine whether her evenings felt peaceful or lonely. Yet standing in front of him now, she felt nothing resembling heartbreak anymore. Only distance. "I am," she answered honestly. Ethan opened his mouth slightly like he wanted to say something else, but before he could, one of the Sterling and Price senior directors hurried toward Adrian with visible urgency. "Mr. Wolf," the man said quickly, "the board approved the merger terms tonight. We are ready whenever you are." Ethan's face immediately stiffened. Scarlett caught the reaction instantly. Sterling and Price had been Ethan's entire future. The promotion, the salary increase, the status he chased after sacrificing everything else. And now the final decision rested in the hands of the man sitting beside his ex-wife. Adrian gave a calm nod toward the director before finally looking up at Ethan. You work there too, correct? Ethan swallowed once. Yes. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. Interesting. That single word was enough to make Ethan suddenly understand how powerless he truly was. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow collapse hidden beneath expensive music and polished smiles. Guests still applauded when the officiant announced Ethan and Vanessa as husband and wife, but the applause sounded thinner now, distracted. Even the photographers seemed more interested in capturing reactions around the ballroom than the ceremony itself. Scarlett noticed everything quietly from her table beside Adrian. The nervous glances, the whispers behind champagne glasses, the way Ethan kept losing focus. Every time another executive approached Adrian with visible respect, power had shifted so completely that nobody even remembered why Scarlett was originally invited there. She was no longer the abandoned ex-wife people expected to pity. She had become the most important person in the room without asking for attention at all. Vanessa sensed it too. During dinner, she laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny and interrupted conversations constantly just to pull focus back toward herself. At one point, she leaned toward Scarlett's table with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. I have to admit, Vanessa said sweetly, you look amazing tonight. I almost did not recognize you. Scarlett met her eyes calmly. That usually happens when people only remember the version of you they benefited from. The nearby table immediately fell silent. Vanessa's expression tightened for half a second before she forced another smile and turned away. Adrian glanced toward Scarlett afterward with quiet amusement in his eyes. You know, he said softly, that may have been the most elegant insult I have ever heard. Scarlett laughed under her breath and reached for her wine glass. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched the interaction with growing discomfort. He had spent years believing Scarlett was too soft for high society, too quiet, too ordinary. But tonight she moved through the room with effortless composure while Vanessa looked increasingly desperate beneath the crystal lights. Then came the moment that changed everything completely. One of the senior board members from Sterling and Price approached the microphone near the stage to make an announcement before the reception dancing began. Before tonight concludes, the older man said warmly, I would like to personally thank Mr. Adrian Wolf for joining us this evening after finalizing one of the largest investment acquisitions our company has ever seen. The ballroom immediately erupted into applause. All eyes turned toward Adrian. He rose politely from his chair, adjusting the cuff of his suit with calm precision, while executives throughout the room nodded respectfully toward him. Scarlett remained seated beside him, elegant and composed beneath the soft candlelight. Then the board member smiled toward Ethan near the stage. And of course, this partnership will create exciting new opportunities for employees at Sterling and Price moving forward. Ethan forced a stiff smile while applause continued around him, but internally everything felt unstable, because suddenly his future no longer depended on hard work or networking or ambition. It depended on the opinion of the man standing beside Scarlett Hayes. Adrian acknowledged the applause briefly before looking toward Scarlett instead of the crowd. Then, in front of the entire ballroom, he extended his hand toward her with quiet confidence. Scarlett looked up at him for one still second before placing her hand gently in his. The movement was simple, elegant, but devastating. Ethan felt something inside him sink heavily as he watched Scarlett rise beside another man with the kind of natural happiness she had never shown during the final years of their marriage. The orchestra began playing again while Adrian led her toward the dance floor beneath thousands of glowing crystal lights. And for the first time all night, Ethan finally understood the truth. He had not lost Scarlett the night of the divorce. He had lost her long before that. He simply had not noticed until someone else showed her what she was truly worth. Near midnight, the ballroom finally began to empty beneath dimmed crystal chandeliers and fading music. Guests collected coats, exchanged final congratulations, and disappeared into black luxury cars waiting beneath the glowing hotel entrance. But even as the wedding came to an end, the atmosphere still felt strangely unfinished, as if everyone understood they had witnessed something far more memorable than a ceremony. Scarlett stood near the grand windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, while soft snow drifted outside through the city lights. The red satin dress shimmered gently beneath the gold reflections of the ballroom, elegant without trying too hard. Adrian approached beside her carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water after noticing she had stopped drinking champagne hours earlier. "You survived," he said quietly. Scarlett smiled faintly while accepting the glass. "Barely." Adrian glanced across the room toward Ethan and Vanessa speaking stiffly with relatives near the stage. "Do you regret coming?" Scarlett followed his gaze for only a second before looking back toward the snow outside. The answer arrived surprisingly easily. "No," she said softly. "I think I needed to see that chapter of my life one last time without feeling broken by it." Adrian studied her carefully, the same calm, thoughtful expression he always carried whenever she revealed something honest. "And how do you feel now?" Scarlett looked down at the city streets, nearly 40 floors below them. 2 years ago, she would have answered differently. Back then, she thought healing meant making Ethan regret losing her. She imagined revenge would feel loud and dramatic and satisfying. But tonight taught her something else entirely. The greatest victory was indifference. It was standing in the same room with the man who once shattered her confidence and realizing his opinion no longer had the power to define her worth. Across the ballroom, Ethan looked toward Scarlett again. Vanessa was speaking beside him, but he barely seemed to hear her anymore. He watched Scarlett laughing quietly at something Adrian said, and for the first time in his life, success no longer felt impressive enough to fill the emptiness inside him. He had spent years chasing status, ambition, and appearances while slowly losing the one person who loved him before any of those things existed. Now another man stood beside her with effortless ease while Ethan remained trapped inside the consequences of his own choices. Scarlett eventually turned toward him one final time. Their eyes met across the nearly empty ballroom beneath fading chandelier light. Ethan looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe regret. Maybe nothing at all. But Scarlett simply gave him a small, polite smile. Not cruel. Not emotional. Just distant enough to make him understand there was no path backward anymore. Then she slipped her hand gently into Adrian's. He looked down at her for a moment before guiding her toward the exit while hotel staff opened the grand doors ahead of them. Cold winter air rushed softly inside. Outside, snow covered the sidewalks in silver beneath glowing streetlights while black cars waited quietly along the curb. Scarlett paused briefly at the entrance and glanced back one last time at the ballroom that once represented humiliation in her mind. Tonight it represented something entirely different. Closure. Adrian opened the car door for her, but before getting inside, Scarlett looked up at the falling snow and smiled to herself. Not because Ethan finally understood her value. Not because the guests admired her beauty. Not because she arrived with a billionaire beside her. But because somewhere between heartbreak and healing, she had finally found herself again. And in the end, that was the part nobody could ever take away from her.